Part 3. Wheels within wheels. 16. The mystery airships. Three major cigar flaps occurred just before the turn of the century, and within the first decade of this one. During the period 1896 through 97, numerous airships were seen in the skies over large areas of the USA. In my book Operation Earth, this flap was briefly mentioned. If we bear in mind that Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin's first airship was tested in June 1900, when it attained a speed of 18 miles per hour, and traveled a distance of 3.5 miles, before an accident to the steering gear caused the flight to be discontinued, then a great black airship that appeared over Kansas, Missouri, in April 1897, was a little before its time. It was seen by 10,000 people. The craft appeared very swiftly, then appeared to stop, and hover over the city for 10 minutes, and after flashing green, blue and white lights, shot upwards into space. This airship was obviously capable of a very high performance far beyond the primitive Zeppelin to be tested 3 years later. Indeed, even in World War I, the German Zeppelins often had the greatest difficulty in finding their way back to Germany after raids over England. During that amazing year, 1897, there were many obvious hoaxes, just as there are now clearly 3/4 of a century later. Donald B. Hanlon, in an article The Airship, Fact and Fiction, published in Flying Saucer Review, analyzed some reports of that extraordinary year. However, after taking into account obvious fakes and misidentifications due to astronomical causes, and mythical accounts written by unscrupulous journalists of the period, Mr. Hanlon concluded. After sifting through data, one is left with a hard core of sightings, now over 200, of a rather unlikely-looking aerial craft which created much commotion among the observers. The only detectable effect the sightings left on the society of 1896 through 1897, is exactly the same as that left by the modern UFO phenomena, a psychological impact. It is clear that the origin of the airship is still very much an open issue. It is also clear that the mystery surrounding its appearance at that particular time in history has deepened. Mr. Hanlon's last paragraph is extremely interesting. Why indeed, did the big black cigars appear over the USA at that moment in time, just prior to the birth of the Zeppelin? Capable, too, of a fantastic performance. Another thing to be noticed about that amazing period, was the absence of modern UFO shapes and sizes. There were no circular, triangular, crescent, and cone-shaped UFOs in evidence during that time. They were to come much later. Let us now turn our attention to two more major cigar flaps, which occurred in 1909. During March, April, and May of that year, these mysterious airships were seen over Britain. However, in the second part of the year they made dramatic appearances over New Zealand. Carl Grove has described the 1909 wave over Britain in Flying Saucer Review. He wrote, "The 1909 airship was a dark, cigar-shaped object, carrying a rather bright searchlight, about 100 feet in length, which maneuvered with ease. Like its 1897 predecessor, it is the behavior and not the appearance of the airship that connects it with the modern UFO phenomenon." Let us quote 3 of the reports from Mr. Grove's collection. May 9. Southend-on-Sea, Essex. Miss H. M. Baville. I was closing the window of my bedroom, which faces northeast at about 11:20, when I noticed a very dark object looming out of the sky, and traveling slowly from the direction of Shoeburyness. At first, I thought it was the gunpowder cloud that one sees after an explosion. It was so opaque and black, and the night was too dark to enable me to see it clearly. After a few seconds, however, it crossed the sky and remained nearly stationary in front of my window. I could see the outline of a torpedo-shaped airship, very long and large. It was not more than a quarter of a mile above the houses and trees, and remained immovable for a few minutes, then rose higher, and traveled very swiftly in a westerly direction towards the coast and London, showing, as it did so, 2 very powerful searchlights at either end for a second or two. I did not hear any sound from the engines, as it was too far off, nor could I discern the aeronauts, but the vessel seemed to travel very steadily and smoothly. Evening News, May 15, 1909. May 14, North Sea. The steamer St. Olaf. A Norwegian trading vessel, was a short way out from Blyth, Northumberland, when a large airship carrying 5 searchlights suddenly appeared. Hovering above the St. Olaf, it directed all its lights onto the steamer's bridge. It was within hail, Captain Agnes reported, but gave no answer to the challenge, and in the glare of the searchlights no detail could be seen. Suddenly, the airship swung off after another steamer a mile or so away, and directed the searchlights upon that. It afterwards made off at a sharp rate towards the south. East Anglian Daily Times, May 19, 1909. May 15. Newport, Monmouth. G. Beanland and A. V. Day, at the local flour mill, sighted a cigar-shaped object stationary over Newport Bridge. Shortly after 1:00 a.m. searchlights flashed from each end onto the bridge. After 10 minutes one of the lights went out, and the object flew off towards Stow Hill. South Wales Daily News, Cardiff, May 17, 1909. Altogether, Mr. Grove included some 43 reports in his survey of the 1909 cigar flap over Britain. Once again, there are questions to be asked. Our own airships capable of any reasonable performance did not appear until some years later. Therefore, what were black cigar-shaped airships with powerful searchlights, capable of hovering for long periods and moving off at high speed, doing over Britain in 1909? The action now shifts to New Zealand. We cannot do better than give you extracts from the account of Mr. Hank J. Hinfellar, Director of New Zealand Scientific Space Research and Editor of Space View. Through the excellent cooperation of a reporter on our main daily newspaper, we have been able to unearth a series of sighting reports that would make any skeptic think twice in regard to the existence of unidentified flying objects. The period in which these sightings were recorded was devoid of any air traffic other than the earliest efforts of the Wright brothers and Count Zeppelin. The former made their first flight in 1903, while the latter launched his first dirigible in 1900. The second ship of this type was destroyed in 1905. During an emergency landing. Although airship traffic dates from 1909, and was later used for bombing purposes in World War I, none of these dirigibles are known to have visited New Zealand. At any rate, the flying range of these craft was so restricted that they had difficulty in making the return flight from Germany to England. Moreover, these ships were cumbersome and their maneuverability was low. Having regard to these facts, it was therefore startling, to say the least, when in the year 1909 cigar-shaped flying objects were reported all over New Zealand. The first of these sightings was observed in the last week of July, and the last sighting was reported in the first week of September. For a solid 6 weeks hundreds of eyewitnesses continued to report the presence of phantom airships in our skies. Sightings were not merely restricted to the craft themselves, but also included, in many cases, their occupants. Dozens of accounts were reported to the local newspapers, and in all but a couple of cases, the actual sightings could be corroborated by several witnesses. As far as localities go, the objects were seen in the north as well as in the South Island, covering an area from Dargaville to Invercargill, a distance of approximately 850 miles. Sightings occurred during the day, as well as night, and the most outstanding feature in nearly all reports was the description of the unidentified flying object. Never at any stage was more than one object sighted at the same time. The shape of the object was usually described as being elongated, torpedo, boat, cigar or codfish. In some cases, always at night, the objects carried strong searchlights, with reflectors, which lit up the landscape for miles. The speed of the craft was varied, and ranged from a cruising speed of 30 miles per hour, to great velocity. Their passage through our skies was frequently described as the sailing of a boat, rather majestically, or as the rising and falling of a bird in flight. Some of the craft put on quite a display while dipping from 2,000 feet to 1,000 feet and circling around. In one instance, 2 local residents of Gore, South Island, reported having seen, at night, a boat-shaped object carrying 2 large fans and 3 lights, which at times were covered by the fans. 2 other residents, dredge hands, in the same locality reported an object shaped like a boat, with an open top that came down through the mist in the early morning. The dredge hands swear they could discern 2 figures on board the craft. A similar airship was seen by several school children at noon. They stated it had the figure of a man seated in it. The manager of a firm in Dargaville observed a cigar-shaped object which moved along the coast, 5 miles from the shore. He watched it for 15 minutes while it sailed on majestically. There is no evidence to suggest that the year 1909 produced any UFO landings in New Zealand. To most witnesses, the 6 weeks flurry of sightings was, however, convincing enough to accept that intelligently controlled alien craft of an unknown identity had been visiting New Zealand skies. If we take all these 3 major cigar waves, of 1896 through 97 in the USA, and 1909 in both Britain and New Zealand, into account, we are faced with the very probable fact that some alien intelligence was taking a good hard look at us. The interesting point is that they seemed only to manifest in cigar-shaped objects, which at night turned on powerful searchlights. What was the reason for these 3 remarkable cigar flaps in 3 scattered parts of the world? We will be advancing some possible theories for these earlier appearances of cigar-shaped UFOs a little further on. However, we must next take a look at another odd phenomenon which took place in the 30s. 17. The mystery airplanes. Hardly had the mystery airship flaps of 1909 finished when we started to be plagued with phantom aeroplanes. John Keel's article Mystery Aeroplanes of the 1930s was serialized in Flying Saucer Review. Actually, Mr. Keel stated that this phase in UFO history started in 1910 when one of the earliest known aircraft in this category performed at night hazardous maneuvers at treetop level over New York City in that year. Keel wrote, according to the New York Tribune of August 31, 1910, it was heard before it was seen. The whirring sound of a motor high in the air caused many necks to be craned towards the Metropolitan Tower at 8:45 o'clock when a long black object was seen flying through the air toward the tower. The vague bulk, as it came into nearer view, took on the semblance of a biplane. It swung past the tower, then turned and described one graceful circle after another around the illuminated structure, its outlines standing out clear in the lights from many windows. The very next night the aeroplane came back and repeated the same performance. The Tribune concluded that none of the known pilots in the vicinity were responsible. Indeed, Keel states the primitive open biplanes of that day could hardly risk fighting the dangerous updrafts around Manhattan's towers, and few pilots were willing to attempt night flying at all. Although Keel reports that there were a few other mysterious aviators from 1910 onwards, it was in the 30s that the ghost flyers really got around. One of the first ghost flyer reports to appear in Doggen's Nyheter, Stockholm, in 1933, came from Kalix on December 24, 1933. It stated simply, a mysterious aeroplane appeared from the direction of the Bottensee at about 6 p.m. Christmas Eve, passed over Kalix, and continued westward. Beams of light came from the machine, searching the area. Now, these beams of light are very interesting. Keel comments that they are a regular feature of modern UFO phenomena. We have seen, too, that they were a frequent characteristic of the airship flaps of 1896 through 97 and 1909, taking the form of what we now term searchlights. Keel makes the interesting observation that in 1934 our planes were equipped with landing lights similar to motor car headlights, and that these would not have been sufficient to provide the powerful lights beamed from the ghost flyers. Keel points out that these fantastic ghost aviators were capable of flying in impossibly difficult weather conditions. He quotes a story from the New York Times about an aircraft flying over New York in a heavy snowstorm on December 26, 1933. According to Keel, the plane was first heard circling above Park Avenue and 22nd Street at 9:30 a.m. Numerous witnesses began to call the National Broadcasting Company. Reports continued until 2:25 p.m., meaning that the mystery plane had circled over Manhattan in a blinding snowstorm for 5 full hours. An amazing endurance feat, if nothing else. Keel reported that in Scandinavia the ghost flyers were very active, and that 35% of all the known sightings of the 1934 Scandinavian wave took place during severe weather conditions. Heavy snowstorms, blizzards, and dense fog were mentioned in many of the accounts. The aircraft even operated at very low level during snowstorms, hedge-hopping with great skill, and circling low over villages, ships and railway stations in hazardous mountain regions remarkably similar to the rugged terrain around Cody, Wyoming. Apparently, the governments of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark took the ghost flyer reports very seriously and launched massive investigations. Keel states, On April 30, 1934, Major General Reuterswerd, commanding general of Upper Norrland, made this statement to the press: "Comparisons of these reports show that there can be no doubt about illegal air traffic over our secret military areas. There are many reports from reliable people which describe close observations of the enigmatic flyer. And in every case the same remark can be noted: no insignia or identifying marks were visible on the machines. It is impossible to explain away the whole thing as mere imagination. The question is, who or whom are they, and why have they been invading our territory?" Hundreds of reports continue to be turned in. For instance, the New York Times stated, January 11, 1934, Alf Carlby. "The ghost flyer is still mocking his pursuers and seems to be growing bolder. At the moment there are reports about a grayish aircraft from Alf Carlby. An observation of the ghost flyer over the forts of Bowdoin caused a sensation. A military guard also saw him over other nearby forts. The Minister of Defense, Wennerstrom, was informed about the incident, but after a telephone conference with the military commander in Bowdoin, he denied the rumor. We are dealing with more than one machine, General Virgin said, there's no doubt about it. Military headquarters refused to say anything further on the matter. Now, what were these phantom aviators doing flying over New York and Scandinavia, mostly in terrible weather conditions to which they seemed impervious, at the same time showing tremendous skill and beaming down powerful lights to enable them to search the area they were operating over? Very similar questions arise in regard to the ghost flyers of the 30s, as do to the mystery airships. The only difference this time is that the vehicle is an aeroplane. However, another very significant factor is becoming increasingly obvious. The manner in which these ghost flyers operate quite imperturbably in blizzards and snowstorms seems to indicate that they are from another dimension, or space-time continuum to our own. Our weather was not affecting them in the slightest.